Okay, I'm speaking to you today from the city of Perth in the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. Pay my respects to the elders past and present. The research I'm going to talk about today is from a project that I'm conducting with Dr Irfan Wahyudi at Universitas Airlangga, and big shout out to Irfan's colleagues, Intan and others in the audience in Tokyo today. We've been looking at the introduction of satellite constellations and how that relates to national communities. This is a project we've been working in and around social imagination around national communities and telecommunications now for about 5 years. And it's really fortunate that at this point in time, there's a radical change in the way that satellites are being used for communications in the world. So we're kind of lucky that within this time frame that we've been doing the telecommunications research, a major change is underway. And my colleagues in Indonesia will be well aware of this because Elon Musk arrived in Bali this week to launch the Starlink service, which is owned by SpaceX. Starlink has created by far the world's largest constellation of low Earth orbit satellites. It has about 6,000 satellites now in orbit, and they provide high-speed internet communications directly to consumers. For the kind of video conferencing we're doing now would work through their satellite system with minimum latency. Whereas if we did this kind of video conference through a traditional satellite, there'd be delays. There'd be basically a 30 times larger delay between me speaking and you hearing my message. So there's a big change underway at the moment, and Starlink is by far the largest constellation, the only one that is available direct to consumers in large parts of the world. And its nearest competitor is a company called OneWeb, which has about 10% of the satellites in orbit and only offers services direct to governments and large industry organizations. Now, Starlink is an American company, and the satellites tend to be launched from the US, so they're under US regulation. And within the way the telecommunications regulation works, is that you really only regulate the receivers or terminals within country, but there is no way really to regulate the signals being sent from the satellites as they orbit above a territory such as Japan or Indonesia or Australia. So it's an interesting space, interesting field to be working in. And when we think about national communities, it's quite an interesting space because satellites broadcast beyond national territories, and the way that satellite television, for instance, was rolled out, say in China, there's always been a grey area, or this tends to be a grey area around licensing, and consumers can often access these services in an unlicensed way. So it's an area where there's a kind of grey area of authorization and control. So it's a really good research space to be looking at. Okay, this is Starlink's map from a few months ago. And you can see that it's available in the light blue countries. It is likely to become available in the dark blue countries, and the grey or darkest countries. There's very little chance that Starlink will become available in those countries for years to come. Okay, the map changed in the last few days with Indonesia coming online for Starlink services. So the interesting thing about these maps is this is Starlink's own representation of the world. It thinks very much in national territories, at least it makes this presentation about national territories when its service itself is really global. An engineer's view of Starlink will look something like this, where those little green dots on screen satellites orbiting around the Earth. That's a fraction of the 6,000 satellites, if you like, moving through space. And there's also some other colors on that map which refer to ground stations, little orange ground stations, which beam messages or data up to satellites and back from satellites back into the main internet backbone. So you've got a couple of ground stations operating as gateways in Japan, and we have many in Australia, but at least none yet in Indonesia. Okay, to understand the context of how Starlink is received in country, Irfan and I have done a bit of work around the history of telecommunications in the region, particularly the linkages between Indonesia and Australia. And from that research, we've found very different understandings of that history. Telecommunications heritage tends to be celebrated in Australia as part of the kind of colonial project, whereas Indonesia, we find the early telecommunications period, at least, is often forgotten because it's associated with colonization. But some things are interesting as we go through the archives and look at things. Some of the language back in, say, 1871 or 1889, sorry, undersea cable was laid between East Java and Western Australia to build a high-speed communication network for the future. And it's the kind of language that we'll still hear today around the Starlink network. We did research around these two undersea cable, other telegraph stations that serve the undersea cable. And through that research, we looked at all sorts of representations of those stations. And this is one that has always stood out to me because of the representation of the workforce in the Broome station. In 1913, it's a very multi-ethnic workforce. And as we've tracked telecommunications through to the present, we can find a multi-ethnic workforce in place throughout history. One of the men, we know at least one of the men in the picture is from from Java, and as were other members of the Kerr people living in Broome, which tended to be a very multicultural town back in the turn of the last century. Okay, so I'll stay on that one for a while. Okay, so by the 1870s, that's when this connection began. Electronic messages were being relayed across the Indian Ocean through a network owned by the Eastern and associated companies. Through their network, a telegraph message could be encoded in Broome, Western Australia, and transmitted by undersea cable to Banyuwangi in East Java, then to Singapore, Penang, overland across to India, then undersea to Suez for relay to the group's headquarters in London. This electronic network relied on a multi-ethnic workforce, but it strengthened the British Empire's grip on the Indian Ocean rim through faster communications that radically improved shipping efficiency and strengthened British subjectivity. Cables carried news from around the empire, providing content for local English newspapers that flourished in Australia by the late 19th century and carried discourse legitimising formation of the Anglo-settler nation. By the first decade of the 20th century, at the zenith of the commercial telegraph era, Dutch imperial subjectivity was flourishing too, emboldening radical expansion of territories under direct colonial rule in the East Indies. Yet major challenges to Dutch colonization emerged during World War I, when communications between the Netherlands and its colonies were almost effectively cut by the British, and afterwards as disillusion with European colonization increased. The Dutch government attempted to reinforce their influence and skirt British censorship through investment in radio technologies, including the construction of high-capacity radio stations, Radio Kutwik in the Netherlands and Radio Malabar in Bandung in Indonesia in the early 1920s. The operation of Radio Malabar relied on Indonesians from the outset, and even as shortwave radio and radio telephony increased representations of Dutch pride and empire in the late 1920s, radio's availability also enlarged the agency of Indonesians on the colonial airwaves. This new form of indigenous agency contributed to an emerging imagination of Indonesian community in the Netherlands and in the East Indies, where Malay language newspapers contained overseas news of Asian victories and self-determination carried by undersea telegraph cables. As the economy and speed of shortwave radio overtook telegraph networks in the 1920s, the British government intervened to ensure the Eastern and Associated Company's legacy would continue through a merger with Marconi Wireless Telephone Company under the private yet government-controlled Imperial and International Communications Company, which was then renamed Cable and Wireless in the 1930s. Around this time, the International Telegraph Union was renamed International Telecommunication Union to reflect its growing responsibilities in coordinating regulation and international connections. In the lead up to World War II, the installation of wireless stations around the Indian Ocean became increasingly important, not just for shipping and aircraft operations, but also diplomatic communications. As Japanese forces overtook British and Dutch armed forces in Southeast Asia during World War II, Indian Ocean cables were severed in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, and radio became the means not only for trans-ocean communications during the war, but also for communicating discourse of the Indonesian state and mobilizing volunteers to fight British and Dutch forces in Indonesia after Japanese surrender at the end of World War II. The importance of radio in the struggle for self-determination is made clear in the 10 or 10 November Museum that memorializes the battle for Surabaya at the start of Indonesia's independence war in 1945. Amid panels describing radio use in sharing the proclamation of Indonesia, a radio is at the center of a diorama on left of screen. And it has 5 figures dressed and equipped to represent key roles played by Indonesians in their fierce street battle against British forces. The placement of the radio at center stage can be read as an instrument of mobilization and coordination for Indonesian participants in the battle. Nearby panels explain that news of reading the Proclamation of Independence in Jakarta was distributed in Surabaya via radio broadcasts in Morse code to circumvent Japanese censorship. The importance of radio was brought home on another panel, showing Gurkha soldiers and British aircraft pitted against the revolutionary Bung Tono as he gives an inspiring speech to his brothers in Surabaya via Radio Republik Indonesia, or RRI. A visit to the museum comes away with an understanding that the success of Indonesia's struggle for independence relied, at least in part, on access to radio communications infrastructure. Okay, and now let's take a look at the right-hand panel. Without a successful armed resistance to colonial rule in Australia, a different kind of revolution around radio is remembered in the Broome Historical Museum in the northwest of Western Australia. Its communication display included screening of the Hello Girls documentary, which you can see in the reflection on the radio equipment, which was about the Overseas Telecommunication Commission, or OTC's, Broome Coast radio station. This documentary by Broome-based Indigenous company Galari Media Enterprises contains interviews with women who worked at the station after the OTC was formed by the Australian government in 1946 to provide all of Australia's communication links with other countries and ships at seas. Challenging assumptions about white male achievement in Australian history, documentary shows that the women of Aboriginal and Asian heritage at the radio station were the important people in town because they controlled domestic and international communications, as well as emergency coordination. Okay, Australia has then invested heavily in the development of international electronic communication systems. The OTC, for example, was a major shareholder in International Submarine Cable Systems, a founding member of the International Maritime Satellite Organization, Inmarsat, and was an early shareholder in the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, Intelsat system. Intelsat was created in 1964 within a framework designed by the United States government to ensure open international ownership of a global satellite system that it ultimately controlled. The Intelsat system enabled large amounts of data, such as television footage, to be sent across oceans by radio wave from a ground station transmitter to a satellite for relay to another ground station. Intelsat's initial owners were the United States with 61% of the shares, Western Europe with 30%, as well as Canada, Japan, and Australia with a combined 8%. As more countries joined, the initial shareholdings were diluted. Participating countries owned the satellites and controlled equipment jointly and their ground station transmission facilities individually. The success of this ownership model ensured that transocean communications would be dominated for decades by a system of powerful but expensive ground stations and geostationary satellites orbiting the equator at an altitude of about 36,000 kilometers, rather than a potentially cheaper system of low Earth orbit satellites with radio transmission capacity demonstrated by the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1, launched by the Soviet Union in 1957, and the size and the orbit under 1,000 kilometers by Sputnik is pretty similar to the size and the orbiting height of the Starlink satellites we see today. So where Australia has tended to invest in international telecommunication systems and has been open to overseas ownership of the satellite and cable systems operating in its territories, Indonesia has bought satellites, and a domestic company has even developed the rare capacity to install subsea cables. In 1976, Indonesia became the third country in the world to own a domestic communications satellite after Canada and the United States. Indonesia's Palapa 1 satellite was built by a US or an aeronautical firm, Hughes, and launched by NASA, supporting the reach of state broadcasters RRI and TVRI across the archipelago. Australia followed almost a decade later with NASA's launch of the Hughes satellites AUSSAT 1 and AUSSAT 2 in 1985. These satellites largely service television and radio broadcasts of the Australian Broadcasting Commission, as well as commercial television services. Investments in satellites took a back seat in the mid-late 1990s in the rush to lay fiber optic cables to connect communities in the Indian Ocean and support emerging demand for internet communications. This boom led to overcapacity and an industry financial crisis that provided an opportunity for Indian and Singaporean companies to purchase major undersea cable networks. The tremendous speed and capacity of fiber optic networks provided fast, cheap, two-way audio-visual communication, which is what we're using today. When the undersea networks were damaged, as they often were by fishing trawlers and geological events, the geostationary satellites provided a poor alternative in transferring rapidly growing internet traffic. The vulnerability of undersea fiber optic cables has led not only to the laying of additional undersea networks, but also the launch of higher capacity, nationally owned communication satellite by Australia with Sky Muster 1 and Sky Muster 2, and Indonesia with the Satria satellite in 2023. Meanwhile, there's been a surge of investment elsewhere in the development and launch of the low Earth orbit or LEO satellites, with a promise of providing continual low latency broadband internet communications direct to consumers for video conferencing, streaming, etc. The first reseller of the Starlink system was a company based in Perth called Speedcast. And in June last year, we made a site visit to Speedcast to take a look at what was going on in the satellite system. And we talked to their technicians. Our key informant at the site was an Indonesian engineer, again, demonstrating that pattern, if you like, of over 120 years of Indonesian technicians and workers basically serving the Australian international communication system. Those large satellites on the right, basically at least one of them serves an Antarctic communication system, a satellite that talks to the Antarctic. It's massive in scale. The little red circles just come up around a Starlink terminal, which basically does the same thing, speaking to a much closer satellite. It uses more power, but it's a very small kit that anybody could install on their own house or even on their camper van. This is what the kit, when you buy a Starlink package, this is what comes inside. It's all very small. We can see where things are manufactured and licensed. We had the units basically explained to us by the technicians at Speedcast when we went down there. So we thought, well, what is the impact of the low Earth orbit satellites on the satellite business? And the first thing is the redundancy of the large parabola. And there's a big pile of fiberglass panels from these dishes at the back of Speedcast as dishes are being replaced, particularly on ships, with the new Starlink system, which is smaller, cheaper. One of the immediate impacts is that engineers, rather than spending time setting up these large custom-made parabolas, tend to spend their time now more in kind of networking functions, working on routers and the computer interfaces, if you like, with the systems rather than doing the installations themselves. So there's already a change and redundancies in the work of engineers because of Starlink. Okay, so more broadly, though, how does Starlink impact national communities? And this is what we're researching at the moment. We haven't finished our data collection because we've been waiting to see what happened in Indonesia. And this week, finally, Starlink was officially approved to sell directly to consumers. It's not to say it hasn't been operating in Indonesia. Early on, there were installations in Indonesian ships going to and forth. There were also some early installations in onshore and offshore resource projects in Indonesia, which were done quietly when officially Starlink wasn't yet operating in Indonesia. But we can see from the history of Starlink, it will often start operating in a country or attempt to operate into a country until the government shuts it down and has hard words with Starlink, and then they may turn off their service for that country. But Elon Musk is very much in the good books now with Indonesia because of the promise of investment and through not necessarily through Starlink, but also through his other businesses. But SpaceX, which launches the satellites, is also an interesting proposition for the Indonesian government too, for the potential of doing satellite launches from Indonesia. Starlink has been aligned, or during the launch, Elon Musk came to Bali to launch the operation of Starlink in 3 different health centers in Indonesia, 2 in Bali and 1 in a more remote area. And this was, I guess, the reason for Starlink's existence over the national telecommunications players was that it could provide faster, reliable access in remote places. It's also formed part of the launch of the Starlink is also being unpackaged in this photo on the left at the Nusantara new capital city for Indonesia. So it's being engaged through that. And it's quite interesting, the sets that are donated for Nusantara are donated through the Tony Blair Foundation. So we see this kind of a continuation of Anglo-American involvement in telecommunications in Indonesia. The article on the far right here is from another colleague at Universitas Airlangga who wrote a few days ago. If I read from the first paragraph or translate, I don't agree that Starlink is given permission to operate in Indonesia. Starlink not only has the potential to bankrupt the national companies in the field of telecommunications and internet service provision, like Telkom and Indosat. Starlink also, actually, I won't go on any further, but it goes on to talk about its danger for separatism and things like that, and the lack of control that Indonesian government would have over Starlink. So it's already kind of blown up in some quarters as a potential threat to the national community. But at the same time, it reinforces the concept of national communities because of the argument about what national communities should be and how they should regulate. In Australia, from the text we've gathered, the response has been quite different. There's almost a kind of an apologetic response in Australia. I've been collecting Hansard transcripts from the Australian Parliament where Starlink appeared for the first time, or the word Starlink appeared for the first time in the Senate in 7th of November 2022. This is about 4 months after the service has been available. And one of the senators asked the question, I'm just interested, this has nothing to do with government policy or anything, but then it raises a concern about Starlink. And then another question about a few weeks later, is Starlink actually regulated by Australia? And the senator's worried there because he pays his bills to Singapore. So we're not seeing the same kind of defense of the nation response in Australia. And I think that relates to that telecommunications history. And there's almost an apologetic regulation of Starlink in Australia from what we've seen so far, which goes back to, I said in my blurb for this, I reflect on Ben Anderson's work. And what we're doing in a way is an extension, I think, of some of that work done by Benedict Anderson when he talked about print capitalism, and he did the comparisons between national responses or the development of nations in response to print capitalism. And I think we're carrying on that kind of work at the moment, and we can learn a lot again by looking back on Ben Anderson's work, particularly his last work, I think, last major book, which was Under Three Flags, which talked about early globalization and how the anarchist movements, international anarchist movements, kind of led to early forms of nationalism. And I guess Ben Anderson haunts our research in more than one way, partly because he died a few days later after I took this photograph in Malang in East Java. And it's kind of It's if you were to walk or travel from Surabaya, where Irfan's doing his research, through to where I'm doing mine down in Perth, you would pass over Malang and perhaps the grave of Benedict Anderson. So I think for me, his research, his theories, his ideas will perhaps haunt our work for a while to come. And that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thor. Okay, do we have any questions? Yes, I see one over there and then one at the back. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr, for your inspiring presentation. But I have one question. Maybe a million Indonesian also have a question like me. My question is, given the numerous remote areas in Indonesia still facing challenges in accelerating internet services, how can the government leverage technologies like Starlink to accelerate digital infrastructure development and support social and economic inclusion in this region? Thank you, Dr. Kerr.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Early on, when Starlink became available, it was licensed somewhat reluctantly, I think, by the Indonesian government for use by Telkomsel for backhaul services to improve connections in those more remote regions. Also, some of that large satellite like Satria, they provide services as well to those more remote regions, but they're obviously slow, and there's a lot of latency and problems with video calling and streaming and things like that. I think the thing that stands out for me in the research about low Earth orbit satellites is to realize, and I think Elon Musk realized this, is that, wow, that's what Sputnik was back in 1957. And the world's gone down the road of a very expensive satellite system, which has meant that data like television data can be beamed to remote locations, but it's been very expensive and difficult for remote locations to speak back through these satellite systems because of the cost of ground stations. So the low Earth orbit satellite, and I think this is the implication of your question, it does bring potential advantages to more remote areas because it enables remote areas to speak back at a relatively cheap price. I think Starlink's coming in at 750,000 rupiah a month, which is 75 Australian dollars. Roughly, which is relatively cheap if it's being used by maybe a village or a village head, something like that in their household for serving several households. So it will bring change, and I think there's a lot of support in Indonesia for the potential of a service, Starlink or a service like Starlink to serve those regions. For Irfan and I, our interest really is in, exactly how do people respond? How does a nation respond? And then how is the nation imagined in relation to this new technology? Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria Castañeda. I am with Southern Methodist University from Dallas, Texas. And I would like to ask, what do you think are the social implications for the satellite constellations being owned by one organization, particularly by one individual? Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the history of satellite, the way that satellites were developed in America, it's often been very lent towards pro-business, been really pro-business over government direct ownership of those satellite systems. So there's been a tendency in the US most of the time to support these kind of almost monopolistic companies. I think AT&T was like that until it was forced to break. It was broken up through kind of through a government initiative. But I think there's a history to understand where Elon Musk has come from and how he's got his advantage, and he got early NASA contracts worth billions of dollars, which encouraged other investors to join him. In the recent history of these low Earth orbit satellites, Elon Musk was a latecomer in a way. The OneWeb satellite system was being built before the Starlink system. It had problems with launching out of Kazakhstan and out of Russia. These were geopolitical problems in the end because of the Ukraine war. And it has left a kind of vacuum where Elon Musk has a monopoly. And I've seen the confidential, if you like, investor documents around Starlink, and its model is very much based on go as fast as you can and try to get as much of a monopoly position as you can before a substantial competitor gets up. And the business plan of Starlink shows that SpaceX shows that basically nearly all of SpaceX future revenue is going to come from Starlink, not from launching tourists into space or anything else. So it's about establishing a monopoly, and it's Elon Musk, so it's unlikely to be the most enlightened monopoly in the world. And we could also see, you've got if we think back to the Iraq War, you've got the Blair Institute in there as well, funding the units that are sent to Nusantara. So people with a bit of a understanding of history of imperialism will have concerns. I think it's right to have concerns. There are bodies that regulate satellites, so the internet, the ITU, it regulates spectrum, but it tends to do that 4 to 8 years after the fact. So there is a point in time where Starlink will be challenged by other companies, and it won't have a monopoly on all the radio bandwidth, but it certainly has a head start. And yeah, it's going to be very hard for other companies or governments to catch up.
Any other questions? I can't see any other hands, Thor, but I'd like to ask a question myself. So you see this very much in sort of like a nothing nihil novi sub soli type things, nothing new under the sun. It's just it's a sort of natural extension of the same type of strains of imperialism, of power concentrated in the hands of a few in order to serve just the wheels of capital. Is that your view?
I think it's more nuanced than that, because if you like, US hegemony during the Cold War with satellites, it relied on open access and US having an ultimate veto on the system, but it didn't tend to interfere with those satellite systems or broadcast. So I don't see it necessarily as an imperial thing. I think it's certainly a capitalist thing. And I think what's happened in the satellite space is very similar to what happened with Facebook or Meta in relation to social media, because Meta or Facebook wasn't the first, it was kind of a latecomer into social media in a way, or citizens journalism was certainly a latecomer. But once it rallied the forces of capital, and it could afford to buy the servers and the engineers, and really monopolize and attract participation in a way that smaller social media sites could never do. It managed to overrun, and it led to the shutting down of many sites that were arguably much more progressive, had better platforms for social interaction than, say, Facebook. And I guess that's the big issue with Starlink. It's not the technology per se; it's just the risk of what happens when there's a monopoly, and things aren't being done. Things that may be done that could be done in much better ways aren't being done in better ways because there's no incentive for the monopolists to do that. I think that's the concern, and there's no real democratic mechanism for improving the way these technology companies behave. If there's no competition, or it's very difficult.
And another thing which I think, given your background in human rights, the role in which individuals like Elon Musk can play in deciding, I think notably the case of the Ukraine sort of situation, as to the sort of power that's usually vested in countries can in fact be vested in individuals.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's certainly the case. But if we look at the history of telecommunications, that's how it all started too, with the Eastern and Associated companies. They held a monopoly that enabled them to set up a network that spanned, every continent. What happens with these networks, and what I can see through the history, and it's the same with what happened in Japan in the early colonial period or before World War II, and what happened in World War II, is that these companies will often argue national interest and appear to work with government on national expansion policies and things like that. And that's good for business by leveraging or by representing national security threat or whatever they can often, or national interests they can empower. They can draw government subsidy into their business and government investment in their business and license to operate. That's how they've operated. But when it comes time for them to really engage in national interests, say like NEC in World War II, or what happened to the Eastern Associated companies, once they get into those kind of hot wars, their companies are taken over by government. The innovation tends to stop. Engineers go off to war and often don't come back from war, and innovation kind of. But maybe, contrary to popular belief, innovation is retarded by war. So that kind of the ultimate engagement in national interest tends to destroy these companies, but they'll tend to represent national interest in order to gain resources from government. So Elon Musk at the moment is trying to represent Starlink being in Indonesia's interest because it will deliver better communications to remote health stations, which it can and will do. But when there's a real kind of hot tension later on, it'll things will change and things will be done differently. Let's hope those situations never happen or never occur. But looking at history, there's a fair chance they will. Yeah.